And I hope you know by now that where I think the Bible is clear, I want to be clear. But where I think the Bible is not clear, I want to be not clear. It's an odd thing for a teacher to say, but I want to be open enough for you to say, it could be a couple of things. So we'll do that together. Here's one thing that's clear. And we're gonna be thorough, so that's why we're doing a series and not a one-night thing. Here's one thing that's clear. It is clear that it is normative, that male spiritual leadership is normative from Genesis to Revelation. That's the pattern. Okay, that's the rule. It's also clear there are exceptions to the rule, and that's what we're going to look at. So leaders are almost always men, but we complementarians need to remember that there are women in the Bible that are doing very leaderly type things, and even if it isn't normative, but that's something we should take seriously. Okay, so let's look at some examples, and we'll just, we'll get where we get. Look at Exodus 15. The first, that marker's garbage. The first category we're looking at is the category of prophetesses. That's prophetesses. Mother? They did. You weren't here last week, and I said, this is what it's like to be with my mother. I mentioned that I didn't have a marker, and the next day I had 20 markers come in the mail. Yes, I have them. They're just not at this, but these will work. I have 7 up here. One of these is good. Prophetesses. Okay, so first one is the sister of Moses, Miriam. Okay, Exodus chapter 15. Exodus 15, we're going to look at a few passages. We're being thorough here, people. Okay, we're going to look at all of them. So you can't say I didn't talk about something. Exodus 20, or 15 rather, verse 20 says, the Lord came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And the Lord said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through. I just said 20, and so I was in 20. I was actually in, it doesn't matter what I was in. Exodus 15, verse 20. Let's try again. Then Miriam, that seems to be more on topic, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women went out with her with tambourines and dancing, and Miriam sang to them. Okay? Miriam defined as prophetess. Look at Numbers chapter 12. She's mentioned 3 times. Numbers chapter 12, or 3 sections. Numbers 12, verse 15. Says, so Miriam was shut outside the camp 7 days, and the people did not set out on march again until Miriam was brought back in. One more. Micah. Go to the right. Keep going to the right. Till you get to the New Testament, you've gone too far. Micah chapter 6. Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. Verse 4. For I brought you up from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery. I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. Okay, I sent before you. Now, here's what we have. That's what we have with Miriam. And Numbers 12 is a big section on her, but we won't read it all for time's sake, but do that. Miriam is defined as a prophetess and is in conjunction with Moses and Aaron leading Israel. Moses is certainly the chief leader. That's Numbers 12 makes that abundantly clear. But Miriam had an important leadership role, whatever that looked like. Okay, second one. 2 Kings 22. Ain't no shame in the index game. If you need to look in the beginning, look up where that is. That's fine. 2 Kings 22. So we got, this one isn't great either. Let's try this one. That's good. We got Miriam. This one is, beautiful name, Huldah. 2 Kings 22, verse 14 says, so Hilkiah the priest and Ahikam and Akbar and Shaphan and Isaiah went to Huldah the prophetess, the wife of Shallum the son of Tikvah, son of and she said to them, verse 15, she said to them, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, tell the man who sent you to me, etc. And she speaks on behalf of God. Okay, so Huldah speaks on behalf of God as the prophetess. And then she's mentioned again in 2 Chronicles 34, but it's the same story. So you can look that up if you'd like. 2 Chronicles 34, it's the same story mentioned again. where the people go to inquire of Huldah. Josiah sends them to inquire of the Lord and sends them to Huldah. All right. Isaiah chapter 8. This one is, we don't get her name, but it's Isaiah's wife. Isaiah's wife. Isaiah chapter 8, verse 3 says, And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said to me, Call his name that. For before the boy knows how to cry, my father, my mother, the wealth of Damascus is full of Assyria, etc., etc. So I went to see the prophetess. That's the line. She's called a prophetess. Okay? New Testament, Luke chapter 2. We have Anna. Anna, Luke chapter 2, verse 36. There was a prophetess, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was advanced in years, having lived with her husband 7 years from when she was a virgin, and then as a widow until she was 84. She did not depart from the temple, worshiping with fasting and prayer night and day. And coming up at that very hour, she began to give thanks to God and to speak of him to all who were waiting for the redemption of Jerusalem. Interesting one. Anna comes to the temple, thanks God, speaks to all who will listen about the coming of Christ to Jerusalem. Okay? Acts chapter 21. Verse 8. On the next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. Verse 9, he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Okay, we got Philip's daughters. You're in Acts, so go back to Acts 2 real quick. Acts 2, verse 16. Peter says, but this, talking about Pentecost, is what was uttered to the prophet Joel. So he's saying what's occurring here is what Joel talked about. In the last days it shall be, God declares, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Okay? One more. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians 11. Verse 4. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head, but every wife or woman, same word, gune, every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it's the same. Point there being, and I'm planning on doing a whole lesson on the head covering thing. I haven't studied that deeply enough to talk about it now. I'd like to do that. But that's not the point right now. The point is that he's giving instructions about women who are praying and prophesying. Here's how you are to do it. So they were doing it. Okay. It's not just that there weren't good men around to do it. So the women had to do it. It can't be that, because there were good men around to do it. Certainly in the New Testament. Certainly in 1 Corinthians there were. Certainly in the Old Testament that's the case. When these prophetesses were prophetesses, there were other male prophets in Jerusalem that we know of at the time. So it can't just be that there weren't good men around to do it. There were. So I think the careful conclusion has to be that there is no inherent problem with women prophesying. Even though there were, we should remember, many more male prophets, okay. All right. Now, there's a whole, your question may be, well, what's prophesying? Good question. All right, let's move forward. No, let's talk about it for a minute. Here's the scholarly answer is, we don't really know. That's the basic. I just want to be totally honest. We don't really know in the New Testament specifically what is meant by prophesying. And the reason is because there is a distinction that's made between Old Testament prophecy and New Testament prophecy, because New Testament prophecy, that Paul tells them to test it to see if it's good, see if it's true. That doesn't happen, like, we don't have them telling to test Jeremiah's prophecies. So there is a difference, and that the New Testament prophecies are to be tested. Let's look at that real quick. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. This is fun for me. I like this stuff. The stuff that in the end I have to go, no. 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 19. He says, do not quench the spirit, do not despise prophecies, but test everything and hold fast to what's good, or hold fast to what's true. Abstain from every form of evil. John writes that again in 1 John, by the way. So don't quench the spirit. Don't despise prophecies. This makes sense to me. Here's what's interesting, is they were despising prophecies. Right? That's an interesting thing. It's something he had to feel like he had to say. Don't despise them, because they were despising them. Why is it the case? Well, probably because some of them are probably getting like nuts and they don't want to listen to them, right? So like Paul, you told us that we should take prophecy seriously, but half this stuff's cuckoo. And so I hate it. And Paul says, instead of hating it, test it to see what is true. Okay, now the hairier issue is there's a time for vocabulary again. There's a big debate about whether or not prophecy is still occurring now at all, which is called cessationism, which is traditionally what Church of Christ has held, some form of cessationism, which says all the miracles have ceased. That's prophecy and speaking in tongues and all those things. And then there's continuationism, which says, shockingly, they have continued. Okay, so that's the debate. It's out there. It's going on. We're not going to solve it tonight. Let me tell you that let's look at the main passage in that regard, and I'll give you just a brief explanation. 1 Corinthians verse 13. 13. Is that what you asked me? 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 11. No, 8. All right, so 1 Corinthians 13, 8. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will cease. That's where the cessationism comes from. Or they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, interesting one there, by the way, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will cease, will pass away. And so the whole debate is, what is that talking about? When is it? So it's good. Prophecies are going to stop. Tongues are going to stop. The whole question is, have they stopped? And there's normally a few lines drawn. The normal line for cessationists says that when the last apostle died, the gifts ceased and the perfect had come. Some say when the Bible came in its fullest, which I think is more difficult to hold, is when it happened. And then some say when Christ returns is when it's going to happen, whatever that means. So you can decide for yourself what you think it means. I'll tell you where I'm at, but who cares? Where I'm at is that seems to be talking about when Christ returns. Now, I've been a cessationist my whole life, something like a cessationist. I call myself now a skeptical continuationist. I'm going to doubt basically every time somebody tells me they're doing something, but I don't see biblical reason that demands that they have ceased. That seems like to me that's talking about the end times. It doesn't matter which view you hold for what we're talking about tonight. Okay, so whether you think they're still going or not, here's the point that's being made. When they were happening, women were doing it. That's the main point that was made. So you can believe either one of those, by the way, and go to church here and be a full member and good standing and all those things, which is one of the things I love about the Church of Christ. We can disagree here, and that's okay. And again, I'm not sure. I don't know. I have a leaning. I'm not sure. Just trying to be careful with the Bible. I've never done those things myself, and I think most of them are fake. But that's another discussion we'll have another day. Okay. The point for tonight is either way, when they were occurring, if they're no longer occurring, they were definitely happening by women. Women were doing that. Okay, that's something that we as complementarians should admit, I think. It would take some real gymnastics to get away from those things because the Bible says it pretty plainly. So position on those things doesn't really matter. Prophecy, what it was, etc., is a little more significant. Okay, so what the egalitarians, the people that want to say there's no difference, take from this is a couple of things. They'll say women prophesied in mixed company, which is Christian talk for boys and girls, right? You swim with mixed company. Women prophesied in mixed company in public gatherings. That's claim number one. And to that I say, it seems that way. Yeah, probably so. It seems that women were prophesying in mixed gatherings in public. And I think that's the only way you can interpret 1 Corinthians 11, especially in line with if you add that to 1 Corinthians 14. We don't do all that today. But it seems that in 1 Corinthians 11, you're in 1 Corinthians, that 1 Corinthians 11 through 14 is about the church, is about when we assemble. That's not really debated. And it's in that passage that it talks about when women pray or prophesy. So women prophesied, prayed in mixed company, men and women, in the public gatherings of the church. I think that's probably true. I think that's probably true. Okay, the second statement, which is more significant, is they'll say, okay, well, prophecy is basically the same as teaching, and so since they were doing that, they can be elders, because elders are the teachers. And to that I say, no. That's definitely not the case. Prophecy and eldering there's a very sharp line between those biblically in every sense of the word. They're never placed beside each other. Even prophecy and teaching, not just eldering. There's a difference in prophecy and teaching. There may be some teaching involved in prophecy and what it was, but they are not the same in prophecy and teaching. Elders are given high qualifications for what you have to be an elder. There's no qualifications given in the New Testament for what one has to do to prophesy. Prophecies were constantly being tested to see if they were true. Elders had the authority to teach. Also, interestingly, Old Testament too, the prophets, their only authority was the prophecy. They didn't have authority themselves where they could just tell people to go do things. The authority was what they said, like the message from God. That was the authoritative thing. They weren't authorities in themselves. A good example of this is when Nathan comes to David, not the second time, but the first time Nathan comes to David, and David says, hey, God has nowhere to dwell, I'm going to build him a temple. And Nathan says, yeah, do it. And then Nathan goes back home and God says, did I tell you to say that? He's not going to build the temple. Go back and tell him. And so Nathan goes back and says, sorry, I didn't realize that was not the message. You're not going to build the temple. It's going to be your son. So Nathan didn't have authority in himself as a prophet. It was his message from God that had authority. Elders have authority from God to make decisions, to lead, to teach, etc. Okay, so number one, and I'm finishing. Number one, women prophesied to men and women in the assembly. It seems that way. I think so. I think that's significant. Whether or not prophecy is still happening or not, that we probably should think about that. Secondly, they prophesied so they can teach and be elders. No, no. They're different. Prophecy and eldering was different even then. Not the same sort of situation. And that story is 2 Samuel 7. I'm sure Luann's trying to find it. Looking at it now, she knows where it is. It's in 2 Samuel 7, if you guys want to look that story up. Okay. I probably should stop here. Now, next time, so that's all the times in the Bible, unless I missed one, which is of course possible. It's all the times in the Bible where it talks about women as prophetesses or prophesying. And I think we as complementarians who believe in male authority should face what seems the real reality, that women were doing something called prophesying in public in the New Testament, and praying as well, by the way. And figure out what that means. Next time we'll move to some other women in the Bible, starting with Deborah, which is maybe the most significant one, in Judges 4 and 5. We'll talk about her. Okay, so your turn. Renee, you're an idiot. This is the time. Yes.